This is the second half of An Honest Search for the Truth, Part 2, Murder and Genocide in the Old Testament. Let's take just a second to go over the 3 listed biblical justifications for genocide. Is the justification for this genocide that the inhabitants were reprobate sinners? The Bible portrays Canaanites as child-sacrificing, beyond saving, unworthy of commingling sinners. Were they so far beyond saving that it wasn't even attempted? No attempt was made for inhabitants of the Promised Land. They were simply all murdered or enslaved. You would have a hard time convincing any rational person that every last human being within the tribes of local inhabitants being murdered was an irrevocably tainted pagan unworthy of the attempt to communicate, negotiate, or, forgive me, indoctrinate. More importantly, however, is the fact that along with the adults, innocent children were murdered in this biblical judgment against the Canaanites. Even if you could argue that the adults deserved the judgment of death, the command was, "You shall let nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them," which included children and was therefore morally wrong. Is the justification for genocide that the solid part of the surface of the earth on which they lived was purportedly promised to another group of people sufficient reason for the mass murder of men, women, and children? No, it isn't. And if you struggle with that concept, think about implementing that decision today in the United States or any other industrialized nation. Trying to take someone else's land because your invisible friend told you it was yours and that you could possess it by use of force probably wouldn't go over too well. Is the justification for genocide because Israelites needed to remain holy and undefiled? The assumption is the feckless Israelites were so impressionable that it was evidently a reasonable conclusion that it would be easier to kill entire nations of people than to risk their exposure to local religious customs, whether evil or merely foreign. Once again, apply this conclusion to modern times and visualize the attempt to implement this gem of reason. Now let's take a second to think about all this justification using reason and rationality. As it relates to justification on the basis of the Canaanites' wickedness and perpetrated genocide being a moral judgment against them, in a nutshell, God says, "You are condemned for sacrificing and murdering your children, so we're going to come in and murder you. And we're going to murder your children." Does this make any sense? It's ridiculous. If the adult Canaanites were guilty of child sacrifice and their mass murder was the divine judgment, how is the murder of the Canaanite children perpetrated by the Israelites not also a sin worthy of judgment? The murder of children can never be justified. We're talking about toddlers, suckling infants, and the unborn. Please take a moment to put faces to the thousands of innocent children and babies that died at the hands of the Israelites. These were innocent children, just like your own, a niece, a nephew, godchild, or grandchild. Guiltless and utterly defenseless, yet God commanded that they be butchered by the sword. If Abel's blood cried out from the ground for justice, then it's amazing that God just turned a deaf ear to the blood of these children and nursing babies. It sickens me, as a mother of 4 precious babies of my own, to think of men of war going through a city and hacking and slicing and chopping innocent-eyed, puzzled children with sharpened blades. It's an abomination. Nevertheless, there is a detachment from the reality of those Canaanite children being senselessly murdered within the conservative Christian community. The believer's assumption that this sounds terrible, but God can't be wrong, enables that disconnection. But even more importantly, it cheapens the incalculable value of human life. Lastly, consider the murderers of Jesus Christ. The Bible contends that the plan all along was for him to die, yet those that murdered him were still held accountable for his death. Even if it was divine judgment against the Canaanites, for the sake of biblical consistency, shouldn't the children of Israel likewise be held accountable for killing the Canaanites? Good and evil, demonstrated in the Old Testament, do not change or somehow become nullified because Jesus died on the cross and the New Testament was implemented. How does this Old Testament God of the children of Israel, colored in the previous scriptures as malicious, jealous, vindictive, and murderous, compare to the God described in the New Testament? Is this the unchanging God we read of in Malachi and Psalms? Despite appearances to the contrary, are all of God's commandments just and righteous? Christian believers, how do you reconcile God's character as it relates to the instruction of the children of Israel for murder and genocide in the Old Testament, with God's character and instruction in the New Testament to love, turn the other cheek, and to have an attitude of service towards your fellow man? Was the murder of innocent children acceptable in the Old Testament because God directed it? Should we expect righteous, moral, and ethical laws to come from God regardless of time or place?